In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Glory to Jesus Christ. Good morning, beloved brothers and sisters. So, we know that when Abraham, the father of those who believe, left Haran, his homeland, he went with his nephew Lot, who journeyed with him. Lot loved Abraham so much, he went with him. And they journeyed all the way to the promised land, and they stayed there for a while. But then they endured hardship, and there was a famine. And just like his children would later do, Abraham went down to Egypt to eat, because there was food in Egypt. And he and Lot and all their flocks and all their cattle and all their loved ones and people lived in Egypt for a time. And then, when the famine had abated, they went back to the promised land. And as they were going back, Abraham's servants and Lot's servants began to fight, because their flocks were so big, and they had so many cattle, and so many sheep and oxen and goats, and all these servants, that they couldn't find places to water. They would argue over wells and watering places, and they would argue over grazing, and all these fights would happen. And so Abraham said to Lot, "We're brothers, we're friends. we are loved ones. We should not fight. The land is big. Go where you wish, and I will go where you don't go." Abraham says, "If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." And Lot looks, and he sees the land of Sodom, and the plain of Sodom. And it looks really good, and it's very green. And Lot says, "I will go and live there." And Abraham says, "Very well, that's fine. I will go to the opposite direction. I'll go into the promised land further from this place." And Abraham departs. And in the very verse of the scriptures that talks about this moment, it says, "And the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked," is what it says. They were great sinners. They were evil. And yet, Abraham, we know, was not. He was a righteous man. The men of Sodom lived in a big city, luxurious city, that was firmly planted in the ground. And they identified themselves with the world and its pleasures and its luxuries. That's what they identified themselves with. That was their identity. Abraham lived in a tent. He never had a house. He lived in a tent. He's the consummate pilgrim. He identified with heaven because he has no lasting home here. This is how Abraham was. Ezekiel talks about Sodom. He says, we think of Sodom as licentious. We think about sexual sins. But this is what Ezekiel says about Sodom. And he's speaking very harshly to his own people. He says, "Look, this was the iniquity of your sister." He's so upset with the Jews at this time that he's calling Sodom their sister. This is how upset Ezekiel is. He says, "Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit." This is what the Lord says through Ezekiel. Now Abraham was not like this. He was humble. In fact, from the scriptures and from the tradition we gather that Abraham washed the feet of every man who walked past his camp. And his camp was huge because he had many servants and many animals. And he was the Lord of this flock, and yet he would wash the feet of the poor that came past him. And he would feed everyone. And he was humble. He was never idle, because if you notice, he traveled all his life, all the way from Haran, all the way to the promised land, into Egypt, and back again. Abraham was always traveling. And so when was Abraham idle? Never. He was never an idle man. Later we read that the Sodomites were conquered by this group of kings who waged war on them. This man named Chedorlaomer attacked them, and he conquered them. And he actually took all of them hostage. He took away all the possessions of the people of Sodom, and he took away Lot, because Lot was living there. And when Abraham heard that Lot was taken, he was very upset. And so he gathered together some servants, and he chased after these kings. There wasn't just one, there were many kings. And Abraham hunted them down, and he defeated them. In fact, he defeated them so badly that he was able to recover everything. All the property of Sodom and Lot, and all of Lot's things. It was really good. And so he brought them back, and the king of Sodom was so happy, he said to Abraham, "I'll give you all this stuff. I'll give you money, I'll give you things." And Abraham said, "No, I want nothing from you. I will never take a single thing from you, so that you can never say you made me rich. God has made me rich. You never did." And right after Abraham wins this war and all these things, Melchizedek comes and visits him and gives him bread and wine, which is a symbol of the Eucharist. So the Sodomites are conquered, but Abraham conquers. Both of them are judged, right? Abraham and Sodom are both judged. Abraham is judged, worthy to behold the Holy Trinity. These three men walk up to Abraham's camp, and he calls them Lord, singular. He addresses them Lord in the singular, and has them sit at his table, and he feeds them. He feeds the Most High God who comes to visit him. Sodom is judged differently. and they are found worthy of fire. Abraham is so good that he pleads for them. Even though he doesn't want to take anything from them, he wants nothing from them, he pleads for them. He says, Lord, have mercy upon them. Abraham's name will reign forever among the righteous. People will bless his name forever. The name of Sodom and the name of Gomorrah will never be respected ever. And so why do I tell you this tale of two cities? Because there's the city of Abraham and there's the city of Sodom. And these two cities continue to this day. They actually have never left us. They're still here. When I look at our society, you'll see why. In this month of all the flags everywhere and this intense love of pride for what is unnatural and what is wrong, a man cannot help but think of this. He cannot help but think back to this time. He thinks about this society in which we live. And then today also we have all the saints of Mount Athos, and all the saints of Russia, and all the saints of Bulgaria, depending on where you are. And so I think of the city of Sodom, which resonates so clearly in the place in which I live. But then I think about these places. Mount Athos is a city. It's a city of many monasteries, full of thousands of people who labor and struggle and pray for over 1,000 years. And so you begin to compare these two things. You begin to weigh them. And you see that in our civilization, we have not taken much from Abraham. We haven't learned from him. We don't have a month to celebrate him and to honor what he's done, but we celebrate other things. And our society is so full of vanity, so full of pride, so full of idleness and entertainment and all these things that are superfluous. The evils that Sodom is known for were not the beginning. Sodom didn't begin like this. They didn't begin with these massive licentious sins. They began with idleness and pride and gluttony and love of pleasure and luxury. When you take pride, that's a terrible sin, and you mix it with luxury, my goodness, you have a terrible mix. But if you take humility and you mix it with asceticism, you have the ingredients for all that is good and everything that is beneficial. And our society has learned not from Abraham and his asceticism, but from Sodom and their love of luxury. And as time has gone on, our civilization has become more and more broken. Because when men love luxury, they grow soft, and they begin to love all their desires, and pretty soon they'll wage war to protect their desires. When a man gives into his lusts, he becomes a slave to them, and he hates anyone who will not allow him to express them as he wants them to. But see, Abraham didn't live in hatred of anyone. Abraham was so respected that when Sarah died, Abraham went to his neighbor and he said, I want to buy a cave to bury my wife in. And this man said, for you, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. You're Abraham, I'm going to give you a cave. You can own the cave on my land, I'll give it to you. And Abraham said, no, I'll pay it. I will buy it. And he forced the man to accept the money. Abraham lived with such love of his neighbors that they respected him so much they didn't want to take his money because they loved him so much, because they honored him so much. And when you look at Mount Athos, they have followed Abraham. They long for this. They have set themselves apart. Are they perfect? No, but neither was Abraham. Abraham made a lot of mistakes. He sinned a lot, actually. He made errors, and yet he never stopped repenting. He never stopped following God. He made mistakes. His faith was weak at times, but he would correct it. And he would say, okay, I've erred, but I'll continue. Right? He never stopped following God, and he was found worthy of great things. The same is true of Mount Athos. There are scandals in Mount Athos. There are failures. There are monks who fall. There are monks who become deluded. There are all kinds of problems. But Mount Athos as a whole sets itself apart from this. It says, no, we will not live in luxury. We want to live in humility. It has much to teach us about humility. If you look at those icons, I didn't have an icon of all the saints of Mount Athos, so I gathered together all the icons I could find to put them there, of the saints of Mount Athos. And there's a saint on your right, will be my left, named Saint Nephon of Constantinople. He was the patriarch of all of Constantinople. And he lived in an awful time in the 1500s when the Muslims would remove patriarchs at will. And when they would take away patriarch, they would actually tell the Greeks, if you want a new patriarch, you've got to pay money for it. And so every time the Sultan needed more money, he would depose the patriarch and say, okay, buy a new one. And so people would have to raise money and put a patriarch back on the throne. And so this Nephon was a monk from Mount Athos who was made patriarch, and he was exceedingly virtuous. And he was patriarch, but the Turks got rid of him, probably for money. And then he went to Romania, where he was there for a while. But the king of Romania was so awful that Nephon said, I'm done with you. I'm done. If this is how you're going to treat bishops, if this is how you're going to be, I'm tired of being a bishop. And he went to Mount Athos, and he went to the monastery he was raised in, and he went there without any bishop's clothing. He went there wearing his cassock, and he said, I'm an old novice, and I want to become a monk. And the other said, yeah, okay, old man, if you think you can be a novice, come here and become a novice then. You can go to the stable and you can shovel manure. And Nephon said, good. This was the monastery he had been in as a young man, and no one recognized him. And so he went there and he began to shovel manure, and he began to do all the things in the stable and to do all these things and to perform all these tasks. And he, who had been censed for many years as a patriarch, would stand there and men would vest him and put gold investments on him, and the deacons would cense him 9 times and people would glorify him in the churches. he was there shoveling manure, and he was very happy because this is what his soul longed for. But the abbot continued treating him this way, not knowing anything. He was humbling this new novice so he could become a monk. And one day he would see lights in the night shining from the stable, and the abbot was horrified. He said, "What is going on? What is going on?" And he began to pray a lot, saying, "What is going on in the stable? Is this some kind of evil? What's happening?" And this angel came to him and said, "Abbot," he said, "you should assemble the brothers, because you've not greeted the patriarch with proper respect. When he comes back from the stable, you should greet him rightly when he's done with his obedience." And the abbot was horrified, and the angel said, "This is Nephi, the former patriarch. You should show more respect." And the abbot said, "Oh my goodness." So he assembled all the brethren. They put on all their vestments, all the priests vested. They took all the banners. They had the censers. They had everything. And when the patriarch came, covered in filth, because his cassock was dirty, he came walking back to the monastery, and they all bowed to him, and they were censing him, and they said, Holy Father Patriarch, They handed him the staff. They said, "Take up the staff of salvation and lead us in the way of God," is what they said. And the patriarch was like, "Oh my goodness, great." But he took the staff, he put on his vestments, and he continued to serve humbly in the monastery. And he continued to labor like this until he died in Mount Athos. He had no interest in going back to Constantinople, and they didn't want him either. And so he was fine being there. But think about this. Isn't this not more reminiscent of Abraham, who never sought to make a name for himself, and who served everyone willingly? That's who Abraham was. See, beloved, the way of Sodom is not for us, and yet, how do I say this? There's two cities, and yet these two cities exist in each heart, in the heart of each man. There is the seeds of Sodom, that's of the devil, the original sin of Adam and all the sins and passions. If we have passions, we have the seed of Sodom in us. If I'm proud, I'm of Sodom. If I'm lazy, I'm of Sodom. If I'm a glutton, then I'm of Sodom, right? This is true. This is what Ezekiel has said. But if we have baptism, if we have chrismation, if we have the grace of God, then we have the seeds of Christ in us too. And so the two cities exist in us. The city of Abraham, the father of all who have faith, the father of all who believe, and of Sodom. And so, beloved, it's for us to choose which way do we want to go, which way do we want to live. We want to live in humility, which is always beautiful. We love humble men. If you meet a humble man, you always remember him and you love him because he's beautiful. The proud, it doesn't matter how handsome he is or how nice his clothes are, you'll never like him. You'll never have love for the proud man. You just never will. And neither will the Lord. The Lord loves him, but he cannot draw near to him. And so we should make our choice. We should choose which way we want to live. I was reading a wonderful book. This was not about Athos. This was about a saint in Italy in the 300s. His name was Bassianus, and he was this young pagan his father was the governor of Sicily, so he was really, really, really rich. His father sent him to Italy to get educated so he could come back and be governor after his father. And Bassianus went to Italy, and he encountered some Christians, and he was converted. And he began to live a really intense life. He was so rich, but he began to fast really, really hard. And he began to pray at night. He began to keep vigils. And his servants did not know any of this. But this is what's so touching and what's so funny. His servants observed his way of life, and they said, Bassianus has become different. They said, he must have become a Christian. Why? Because only Christians live like this. Only Christians live like this. I was so touched by this. And yet today, Christians don't have this reputation, that they live like this, that they live with great virtues and exceeding goodness. Rather, in some ways, we're no different than the people of Sodom when you look at us outwardly. And this is a very sad, sad reality. Luxury in food is dangerous, beloved. I'll tell you another story. This story was told by a monk from Mount Athos, but not about an Athonite. There was an elder in Greece who on Pascha, right? He served the Paschal Vigil, he sat down and he ate some eggs, he ate some dairy, and he rested. Which is what you would do, right? That's what all priests do, right? On Pascha. After you serve all these services, you sit down and you eat and you rest. Well, this good elder suddenly received a call from a woman who said, my daughter's possessed. Will you come and exorcise her? And he was like, oh, I'm tired, but I will do this. And so he got up and he went. He had just eaten. No one told him an exorcism was going to happen. So he had eaten a lot. And he went to the place where this woman was and her poor daughter. And when he arrived, the demon who was in the daughter yelled at him and said, you old goat, what, are you going to come exorcise me on a full stomach? Get out of here. Leave. I don't accept priests with full stomachs. Leave. And the man said, you're right. This elder said, you're right. He turned around and left. And the woman was in despair. The priest that she called is gone. What is she going to do? Her daughter is in this massive torment. Well, 50 days later, on the Monday after Pentecost, a group of men come to the same house, carrying the priest, because he has not eaten since that day. He's been fasting all throughout the season of Pentecost, the season of Pascha, right? The season where people are eating a lot, right? Everyone's eating a lot. Every Wednesday and Friday you can have fish and all these different things, but he wasn't eating at all throughout this season of joy because he was waging war with the prince of Sodom. And so when he went to this woman's house, they carried him, these men had to carry him in because he was so weak. They carried him in, and this creature that was inside this girl yelled at him, and he said, "I'm leaving. I don't even want to look at you. You are so awful. Get away from me." And he fled. He left. He said, "I will never come back to this girl ever again. I will never come to her ever again." And he left. Because the way of Abraham, the way of humility, the way of Sodom are contradictory. They cannot combine. They cannot cohere with each other. When we live in luxury, the devil rejoices because it makes us soft. When we fast and when we become humble, he cannot bear it because it is so contrary to him. And yet, it is like Abraham and it is like Christ, because Christ was this way. He was so humble and he was so careful with himself. He had ribs that were exposed because he didn't eat much. He lived a good life. And we should do the same. May we follow the city of Abraham, and may we go with the Alphonites and dwell in this city, always, now and ever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.